Hi, everybody. My name is Salvador. I work for the International Studies Association as their Director of Professional Development. Today, I'm here with Erica France and Joseph Wright, who are going to be discussing the origins of elected strongmen. And they're going to be focusing on how personalist parties destroy democracy. So this is a really, really timely topic. I'm very excited that they're here. I'm really looking forward to the presentation. There's going to be a question and answer session, a discussion at the end of the presentation. You can ask your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, either works, and we'll address them all. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Erica.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for having us today. I am going to take the lead and do most of the talking in the session. And we are very excited about this project. It's part of a book that we've been working on for many years now. And the book comes out any day. It's of the same title, Origins of Elected Strongmen. And the idea for all this is deeply rooted in two kind of current themes that we're seeing happening globally. The first is the rise of democratic backsliding happening from within, which is something that's often reported on. And the second is this kind of wave of personalism that we witnessed in authoritarian settings, but that we've noticed is happening in democratic ones as well. So that's kind of some of the background there. And I'm not going to get into some of the trends with respect to democratic backsliding. I'm going to focus at the start here with the rise of personalist politics. So Joe, Andre, and I all have done work on dictatorships and quite a bit of work on personalism in dictatorships. But we noticed that there seemed to be a trend happening in democracies too, with respect to the rise of personalist politics. And there is a fairly large literature that has been devoted to this in democracies in terms of the rise of personalism in a range of domains, such as media reporting, where there's more focus on the individual, or political campaigns, where things have become more candidate rather than party centered. So this research agenda is very much embedded in this rise of personalism that's happening around the globe in democracies. And in terms of why we're seeing more personalism in politics and all of these different arenas, there are two big ideas out there that have been proposed in the literature that have quite a bit of support. So the first has to do with partisan de-alignment. And here the focal point is often on Europe and the rise of non-traditional parties and the decline of the parties that we're used to seeing in European countries. And this headline here from the New York Times in 2022 gets at this, where it says, "Are traditional political parties dead in France?" And here the headline's referring to the fact that the Socialist Party, which was a long-standing party in France, did really poorly in the elections that year. So the idea with this partisan de-alignment is that voters no longer feel the same attachments that they used to traditional parties. And in this void, personalist parties or personalist politics has emerged as somewhat appealing. And I can get into later, I'll get into some of the dynamics underlying this this process. Okay, so one big argument is that there's been a partisan de-alignment that's created space for personalism. The other big argument in the literature is that there has been a big shift in the media landscape, in particular that the rise of new media have made everything more focused on the individual. And not to show my cards, but I find this argument particularly compelling when we look at El Salvador's Bukele, who I have here. He very much, in his rise to power, very much embodies the ways in which the changing media landscape has opened the door for personalism. So this is a headline that says, will El Salvador's Bukele be the next social media president? He was known for being really savvy in his use of new technologies to develop his own brand. So rather than having to rely on a traditional party to to propel himself to the nomination, he was able to create that same sort of brand just by going to new media. So this is kind of the backdrop. These are the two major ideas that have been proposed to explain this rise of personalist politics that we're seeing globally. And our focal point is going to be on personalism in the ruler's party specifically. So scholars have looked at personalism in a number of different domains, as I mentioned, some of which have more evidence than others in terms of a rise. We're going to focus on personalist parties, and in particular, personalism in the incumbents parties. So we're not going to look at party systems in general, or the party institutionalization or things like that. We're going party system institutionalization. We're going to focus on the party that supports the incumbent, and we describe personalist parties as those that are vehicles to advance a leader's personal political career, such that the leader has more control over the party than do other senior party elite. So rather than the party being a vehicle or platform for policies, what we're seeing with personalist parties is that they are really focused on the leader and advancing the leader's career. And here we have an image from Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, who created his own political movement as a way of gaining office in Venezuela. This is very much a typical personalist party. In fact, I'll show some evidence of this later, but one of the best indicators of whether a party is personalist is whether the leader created the party. And that can actually give us a really easily observable snapshot of levels of personalism. So if the leader, so one way of thinking of personalism is whether you have the party pick the leader, which is what we would see in a traditional programmatic party, where the leader has to work his or her way up the party ladder to get to that position, or whether you have the leader picking the party. And that latter scenario is a personalist party. Okay, so our big argument is that personalist parties are bad for democracy. And this is one of the first studies that has looked at the consequences of personalism for democratic outcomes. And as I mentioned, we focus on the incumbent party. And our big argument is that these parties are harmful for democracy because elites in these parties have very little capacity or incentive to do much when a leader makes a grab for power. And here I have an image from Benin. This is Patrice Talon, whose trajectory and pathway to power is very much consistent with our argument. And indeed, democracy in Benin is no more. Okay, so the bottom line argument is that when leaders come to power backed by personalist parties, we are likely to see trouble ahead for the democracies that they govern. And in terms of how this happened, I kind of got at that in the last slide, but I'm going to explain it a little more. Here is Hungary's Viktor Orban kind of chopping off Hungarian democracy. And this is, again, a situation where Orban was a founding member of Fidesz, so red flag there, personalism, and comes to power and slowly over time dismantles democracy in Hungary from within. So we argue that when leaders come to power backed by these personalist parties, they have essentially handpicked their party elite. And the power dynamics are really tilted in the favor of the leader. So the elites are usually loyalists of the leader. They are sometimes family members, friends of the leader, and they owe their political careers to the leader. So their futures are only safe as long as that leader maintains power. Which gives them very little incentive to do anything to stand in the way of a leader's power grab. And on top of that, the power dynamics are so tilted that they also don't have the capacity to mobilize against the leader, even if they wanted to. Okay, so to summarize some of the key messages that we put out there, we begin with somewhat of a standard political science assumption that leaders are going to seek opportunities to expand power. Now, not all leaders end up pursuing a power grab, even when they could. But we're going to operate under the assumption that most leaders do do think that, the world would be better off if they had more power. And even if they don't have the intent necessarily of harming democracy, that, they're better off at advancing their own policy or political agenda if there are fewer constraints on their rule. So we think that leaders who are backed by personalist parties are going to be more likely to succeed in these efforts. Um, so our focal point is really on this incumbent support group of the leader. We think that once these parties in particular get legislative majorities, I'll return to this later, that the door is really wide open for these groups to harm democracy. So there's very little that an opposition movement can do, for example, when these personalist parties have legislative majority. And again, this is because elites in these parties lack the incentive or capacity to push back against a leader's power grab. Okay, so I wanted to briefly touch on how this all meshes with some of the dominant existing arguments in the literature. So anybody that's been paying attention to the news has heard the terms populism and polarization, which have featured very prominently in existing narratives about why we're seeing democracies at risk today. So in terms of populism, the basic idea is within this populist literature is that these populist leaders come to power and they argue that there's a corrupt and an inept elite, and that you need a strongman leader to properly address society's problems because these existing institutions have gone bad. So the leader is really trying to connect with the people, create these us versus them narratives, and this all opens the door for them to deteriorate democracy from within. So our study speaks to, or draws from, I guess you could say, this research on populism, in that it's been very helpful in kind of mapping out the pathway through which today's democracies are falling apart, that it is happening at the hands of these democratically elected leaders who leverage the situation to attack democratic institutions and propel themselves to greater power. That said, there are a lot of problems with populism as a narrative for explaining democratic backsliding. And I'm not going to get too into the weeds with this, but populism is a really fuzzy concept. So there are debates about what it means to be a populist, for example. And on top of this, we show this in the book in quite a bit of detail. Oftentimes, existing measures of populism are based on expert surveys of whether a leader or party is populist. But those perspectives of populism are often contaminated by the leader's own behavior while in office. So we provided quite a bit of evidence that oftentimes leaders who have done harmful things for democracy are then labeled populist, which makes it very difficult to disentangle cause and effect, or to show that populism is what is driving democratic backsliding, when observing democratic backsliding is what causes us to label a leader as populist. One of the nice things about looking at personalism is that it is much cleaner analytically and easier to measure. There is a lot of overlap between personalist parties and populist parties, but we're able to provide evidence that personalism, there's something unique about personalism that is driving a lot of these behaviors that we're interested in. Okay, in terms of polarization, there are a number of studies that have shown that polarization is harmful for democracy, and the precise pathway through which it's harmful varies based on the study. But one of the dominant arguments is that when you have this really polarized society and the two sides really don't like each other, that it makes individual voters more likely to tolerate leaders' abuses of power, because if it means keeping the other side from getting in. So the more that these two sides really don't like each other, the more that they're going to be willing to tolerate abuses of power on the part of the executive. So that we don't take issue with that line of reasoning, but we think that the situation is somewhat more complicated, in that we don't think that polarization is something that comes out of nowhere. Rather, I'll show this some evidence of this later. we think that leaders themselves, through their attacks on democracy, end up polarizing society. So the relationship between democratic backsliding and polarization is more complex. Indeed, this is actually one of the big contributions of the book, is illustrating the ways in which the two are really interlinked, which I'll return to later. So we do think that polarization does help weaken some of these bottoms up checks on a leader's behavior, but also that leaders themselves stoke or further divide society through their actions while in office. Okay, so in terms of some of our big expectations, when leaders backed by personalist parties come to power, we think that horizontal checks on their leadership are going to erode. So we think that they are going to try to consolidate more power and that they're going to be able to get away with this when the party's personalist. So we should see executive constraints go down. And then we also think that these vertical checks are going to erode, some of this bottoms up ways in which ordinary citizens might be able to check a leader. And here we think that the leader's behavior, so precisely these this chipping away at executive constraints, that is going to polarize society, which subsequently will make voters less likely to do anything when to vote the leader out, let's say. And then we also think that the leader's behavior is going to change how their supporters think about what's healthy in a democracy. And we think it's going to decrease their commitment to democratic norms of behavior. So through both of these different pathways, we're going to get a situation where democracy is going to deteriorate. And we show this by looking at declines in respect for civil liberties, declines in levels of democracy, and also an increased likelihood of democratic collapse. Okay, so I'm going to show a lot of different pieces of information that are consistent with this story, but I just wanted to repeat the bottom line. We have a lot of evidence that when leaders come to power backed by personalist parties, that the chance of democracy being harmed increases quite a bit. Okay, so in the book, we go through this, intricate story of how personalist parties are harmful for democracy. And we actually have the part on democracy is chapter 4, and that comes first just to kind of like give the takeaway message. But for the purposes of today, I'm going to go in more of a, not chronological, but more of that sort of order. And I'll start off with an example from El Salvador, which we reference because it really nicely illustrates the full arc of this argument. So here we have Nayib Bukele, who I already showed an image of before. He comes to power in 2019. And his rise to power is consistent with the two dominant narratives in the existing literature about partisan de-alignment and the changing media landscape being important for personalist politics. So, like I mentioned, he comes to power in 2019, and he is the first president to come to power in El Salvador who was not one of the two major parties since the end of the Civil War. So this really indicated that voters had shifted. There were major problems with corruption and crime at the time, making voters kind of fed up with the traditional establishment. And at the same time, Bukele is a real social media whiz. So he was effectively able to build a following, even though he didn't, slowly work his way up the party ladder. So he created this movement called Nueva Ideas, which was his launching pad to win the presidency. The story is a little bit more complicated than that, but I'm not going to get into the details. And, so party creation is a big red flag that we have a personalist party. But the symbol of Nueva Ideas is an N, but the N does not stand for Nueva Ideas. It stands for Nayib. So this is like another indicator that we have a very personalist party. So trouble comes after Bukele comes in. And I want to mention that we often don't know that these leaders are going to be bad for democracy at the outset. In fact, when Bukele was elected, The Economist referred to him as a rising political star. So there was little red flag that, he really was going to be an autocratic iron fist type of leader, at least prior to him coming to power. So then he wins office and he starts doing some alarming things. So he ordered the security forces in 2020 to take over the opposition-controlled legislature for a day to get approval for his security funding requests. This was this very dramatic event that got a lot of media attention. He also tried to rule by decree during COVID-19. This was later blocked by the judiciary. But then in 2021, and this is important, Nueva Ideas won really, really big in the legislative elections. So once the party got the majority, and I didn't mention this, but higher ups in the party are friends and family members of Bukele, he then dismissed the attorney general and all of the judges on the highest court. So there goes the judicial opportunity for constraining Bukele. He purged the judiciary, he packed the courts with his loyalists, and the legislature basically just became a rubber stamp for Bukele's policies. All of this he did while resorting or relying on some really insightful rhetoric. And he was basically kind of, fueling the flames of pre-existing societal divisions in El Salvador. He, is kind of unhinged in terms of the statements that he makes. There's no one in the party that says anything besides supporting Bukele. And in this instance, most people who follow El Salvador know that he's hugely popular to this day, even though he's done these things that are not compatible with a healthy democracy. That said, this path that El Salvador is on very much suggests that the future of democracy looks bleak there. And I didn't mention this earlier, but for the purposes of the book, we do separate out executive constraints from quality of democracy. And this enables us to more carefully get at the pathway through which these things are happening. Okay, so Bukele is very much, on my list. This regime is very much on my list as on the verge of democratic collapse. At some point, there will be opponents to his rule, and he is likely to use all the tools in his toolbox to ensure that he stays in power. Okay, so we spent a number of years coming up with a ruling party personalism measure, and I'm not going to get too much into the details of what this entails. We have a number of narratives that try to get at some objective indicators of personalist parties. Importantly, we measure personalism in the party at the time that the leader comes to office. And we do this because we're trying to avoid contaminating our measure of party personalism with the sorts of behaviors that the leader does once in power, which kind of circles back to that issue with the populism literature that I mentioned earlier. So we're going to look at levels of personalism in the incumbent party when the leader comes to power. So as I mentioned, this is pre-election information prior to observing the leader's behavior while in office. We have a sample of 106 democracies for a 30-year period. So most of the post-Cold War period here. These are all of the indicators that go into our measure. Again, I'm not going to get too into the details here. It turns out that, even if you didn't want to do all of this complicated, compilation of data, that if you just look at whether the leader created the party, that is pretty telling for whether democracy is at risk. Okay, so in terms of what sorts of parties have low levels of personalism, here is Bachelet of Chile. That is a situation we have low levels of party personalism. Medina of the Dominican Republic, Sanguinetti of Uruguay, these all have low scores. And then in terms of places where we have high scores for party personalism, Chavez of Venezuela, Correa of Ecuador, Fujimori of Peru, and of course, Bukele of El Salvador. Okay. So let me see if I can. This shows you the levels of party personalism using our index over time. And that is the red line there. As we would anticipate, it's going up throughout that period. And importantly, that gray line shows the number of democratic collapses. So this kind of nicely fits in with our story that these two things are happening concurrently. I'm not going to get into too much of the data, but I do think it's important to add that this is a global phenomenon and that we're seeing higher levels of party personalism in all parts of the world. So it's not something that is unique to any particular region. I want to first just provide some evidence that personalist parties indeed are unique. So, we're trying to show that this type of party is very different from a more programmatic policy-based party. So we look at, or we anticipate that elites in these parties are going to have less party and governing experience. They're more likely to be people that the leader just picks up as loyalists. We think that their careers are going to depend more on the leader than the party. We think that the leader is going to have greater control over party resources and nominations, which is really going to be consequential for prohibiting these actors from pushing back against the leader. And then we also think that local party organizations are going to be weaker and more impotent in this process. So I'm going to go through some of this a little bit quickly, but we show first that as levels of party personalism increase, the elites in the party are going to have fewer years of experience, both within the political party and in government. I think it's important to show that this is not the case with populist parties. So here we split parties into two bins, whether they had low party personalism or high party personalism, and then also whether they had low party populism or high party populism. And we see that for the personalist parties, there are pretty big differences in both government experience, which is on the left there, and party experience, which is on the right. In that parties with low personalism, their elites have a lot of experience compared to those with high personalism. We don't see much difference among populist parties, which is very indicative that personalism is capturing something that populism can't. Okay, I see some questions popping up in the chat, but I can't really read them at the same time, so I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait till the end to address those. Okay, so we
Pop
also
on and try to get those answered in the Q&A or in the chat.
Okay, so you do want me to address them now?
No, I'm just saying I will.
Oh,
I will
okay.
address them in the chat in a written format.
Okay, great. All right. Here we have some information or data rather that show that party personalism also means that the leader is more likely to control party nominations. That's that left graph there. In the middle, the leader is also more likely to fund the party, also suggesting very tilted bargaining dynamics within the party where the leaders can be quite a bit more powerful. And that local party organizations are going to be weaker. They're going to decline with higher levels of party personalism. So we provide a lot of evidence that these parties are different, and they're different in the ways that we might have anticipated, which should mean that these elites actors have less incentive and capacity to do much against a power grab. Okay, so I'm now going to very briefly show you some evidence that's in chapter 5 of the book that shows that when leaders backed by personalist parties come to power, that we see declines in checks on the executive. Now, we look at these declines in 3 domains: in the legislature, which is on the left, the judiciary, which is in the middle of this graph, and then the bureaucracy, which is another arena that can potentially check the leader. And that's on the right there. And we show this across the board first, but here I have it by legislative majority. And the basic message is that when personalist parties come to power, we are likely to see declines in executive constraints in all of these arenas, in the legislature, the judiciary, and the bureaucracy. And this is particularly true when that leader's party gets a legislative majority. So this suggests that once these parties get into a situation where they have dominance in the legislature, that there is really not that much that stands in the way of these leaders consolidating more power. And indeed, this also helps to explain to some degree why when leaders come to power backed by personalist parties but do not have a legislative majority, that democracy can still withstand that experience or episode. I'm going to spend more time talking about erosion on societal checks on the executive, because a lot of this is a little bit more of a novel contribution that we have. And here, one of the things that we wanted to speak to is whether voters simply don't support democracy anymore. And that's why we're seeing this sort of thing. And we're trying to push back against that narrative that the reason why we're seeing democracies in some parts of the world erode from within is not necessarily because voters suddenly don't like democracy, but rather that this is a top-down sort of dynamic where the behavior of the leader and the leader's party actually influences the ways in which the overall societal fabric. It's both polarizing, we think, and it also changes how supporters think about democracy. I don't want to get into too much detail of it, but as academics, we often think that ordinary citizens have a much more complex understanding of what democracy is than what they actually do in practice. So to some degree, we also are kind of pushing back against this idea that it's just ordinary people suddenly disliking democracy in terms of why we're seeing what we're seeing. Okay, so I'm going to start with polarization, and here we have a little elephant and a donkey, American politics here. I'm right and you lie. No, I'm right and you lie. The graph on the right shows, using two different sources, levels of polarization across the globe over time in democracies, and you can see that it's gone up. So it's not just, you know, your instinct or observation that polarization seems to be worse in many places. The data suggests that indeed it is worse. And this has been proposed, like I mentioned, as a reason why ordinary people might re-elect or support leaders who have engaged in bad behavior because they so much dislike the other side. So we don't take issue with that story, but rather suggest that it's a little bit more complicated. And one of our observations was, you know, thinking about the U.S. and the U.S. experience. You know, Trump came to power, pursued a lot of policies that most experts thought were troubling for democracy. And those individual acts themselves cause a lot of divide among people. So Democrats rather, like you might anticipate, when Trump would do things like, you know, attack the judiciary and say harmful things about judges he didn't like and so forth, Democrats would say, oh my goodness, this is so alarming, this is so harmful. And it would make them dislike Republicans more. But then importantly, Republicans also would respond to these sorts of accusations with defiance. Rather than saying, oh, you know, yeah, you're right, that was harmful for democracy. Instead, it was like, well, what about what your side has done? And both sides were really, you know, using a term we would call motivated reasoning, were seeking out information that was consistent with their pre-existing position, further intensifying the divide. So we think that the leaders' actions that are harmful for democracy actually are a big cause of or intensify polarization. Importantly, when the party of the incumbent is a personalist, the elites get in line behind this narrative, and they provide very important cues that what the leader did was not wrong, and that all is well for democracy. And voters internalize those cues and dig in their heels even more. So here, party personalism is really important because you see the leader do something that's harmful, and elites around the leader either not saying anything or endorsing it, rather than speaking out and saying, well, actually, you know, I'm not okay with this. Okay, so I'm not going to show too much of the evidence, but in the book, we're able to illustrate that when leaders attack democracy or attack constraints on the executive, that it itself increases polarization, and also that it's even more likely to do so when the party of the incumbent is personalist. So this is, in our view, one of the bigger contributions of the book in terms of helping us disentangle the complex relationship between polarization and democracy. We also look at how personalist parties shift ordinary voters' understanding of what's healthy in a democracy. So we end up focusing on support for political violence. There's a lot of different ways that you might try to measure a democratic norm or support for a democratic norm of behavior. But we see support for political violence as kind of the ultimate breach of democratic norms. In a healthy democracy, you don't want ordinary citizens supporting the use of political violence, right? That's kind of a no-brainer there. So we think that party personalism, and in particular, the leaders' actions and the elites' support and endorsement of those actions, is going to change how their supporters think about what's normal and what's healthy for democracy. So you might survey them and they'd say, I do support democracy. Democracy is great. But then when it comes down to it, they also think that it's fine to call for a military coup, let's say, to get what they want. And indeed, that's what we saw happening in Brazil. I have an image from Brazil on the left there, where this supporter of Bolsonaro is calling for a military intervention. And the way that the narratives from the top are coming out in these situations is that this is totally fine, and that to get what you want in your healthy democracy, you need a military to intervene, which, as academics and people who follow politics closely, we know that that's actually harmful for democracy, right? So we show this in a variety of ways. I'm going to talk briefly about one of them, which is the graph on the right. I do want to say that when we look at what happens when personalist parties lose, okay, and we look at whether it's the case that when they lose, that their supporters are more likely to support political violence, essentially whether they're going to be sore losers in the contest. And we do show, looking broadly at incidences of levels of electoral violence, that when the outgoing loser party was personalist, that we see more election violence, which is troubling. And then we also look at individual voters and what they report in surveys in terms of whether they support political violence. And we find that when they voted for a losing party, they are more likely to support violence if that party was personalist. And this isn't because personalist voters for personalist parties naturally are more supportive of violence. We find evidence contrary to that, but rather that when that party has been in office and then loses, they shift their understanding and they suddenly become more likely to support political violence. Okay, and in that way, this shifting understanding of what's healthy in a democracy also helps to explain why these leaders don't face vertical checks. Lastly, we provide a lot of evidence that ruling party personalism is bad for democracy. We show this looking at a ton of different things. So democratic decay, which is on the left there, which is just a small decline in democracy, democratic erosion, a larger decline in democracy, and then democratic collapse. And here I'm showing this just looking at difference of means tests with whether the leader created the party or did not. And just by splitting up leaders into these two bins, we see that there are meaningful differences in harm to democracy. Okay, so one of the big messages that comes out of this project is that party personalism is a red flag for democracy. So it's pretty easy to observe, particularly if we focus on just whether the leader created the party. Here I have Javier Milei of Argentina, who recently came to power there. He's a libertarian. He helped create the Libertarian Party. His sister is very influential in the party. So we're seeing all these ding, ding, ding party personalism. And he's also, as you might anticipate with personalist parties, pretty much unconstrained in terms of the sorts of things that he wants to say. So one of the implications of this research agenda is that this is really a red flag, that trouble could potentially be on the horizon in places like Argentina, particularly, and this is not the case there yet, if that party were to secure a majority. In terms of the contemporary implications, and then I'll wrap this up, I've already been talking a lot. This study, or this agenda, helps shed light on the pathways through which democracies today are at risk. And it also puts emphasis on something that traditionally is kind of boring, I think, for observers: political parties. So it turns out that the type of political party that leaders come to power with is actually really consequential, and that there is a lot of good that can happen out of more traditional parties that advance a clear policy agenda, where leaders get their nomination through experience within that party. We also see the study linking well to existing research we did in the past on, I have this on the right here, personalism and dictatorships. So we know that personalist dictatorships are responsible for most of the world's bad behavior. We also know that they're on the rise. And this study helps connect the dots that when we see leaders come to power in democracies backed by personalist parties, it paves the way for democracy to collapse. And ultimately, the new dictatorships that form are more likely to be personalist in nature. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We have some recommended resources that I can provide to people who are interested later of different studies that offer angles at some of these same underlying ideas. And then we also have some questions to consider in terms of how parties and elite dynamics end up becoming influential for democratic backsliding. But I'm not going to get too much into these because I think we did have some questions in the chat. So I'll go ahead and close up and go back to this slide, I think. How do we want to do this one?
So,
Okay.
hey, Erica, I'm going to interject here for just a second.
Thank you.
We've got one hand raised, and so I want to right now, and I want to go to that person so they can
Okay.
answer, chime in here, and then we can try to answer their question. I think you're on mute.
Hello, am
Yeah.
I audible?
You're good now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Professor Franz, thank you very much for a very clear and very interesting presentation. I'm a PhD candidate at American University, and I study civil-military relations in the context of democratic erosion. So this was a fascinating talk. I have two questions. Number one, in your book, does it matter if the system of government in democracies is different? So if it's a presidential form of government versus a parliamentary form of government, how does the political party being captured by the leader or the leader creating a party, does it get affected with these different forms of coming to power? That's number one. And number two, I understand that party creation, I mean, you focused a lot on party creation and that being responsible for a higher likelihood of democratic erosion. It brings to mind Israel and India, where the current elected strongmen come from traditional parties that they've significantly transformed over the course of their leadership. So as opposed to party creation, how does the transformation of a traditional political party to a personalist party affect your findings? Thank you.
Thank you for those great questions. I can tackle them, or Joe, do you want to? I don't care.
You can go ahead and chime in on that.
Okay, I'm on a roll. Why not keep
Maybe
it going?
I'll add to your answer.
Okay, so Joe, who was our statistics expert, did a ton of different tests that tried to account for differences across democracies and their institutional makeup. So we do find that the results hold regardless of whether the democracy is presidential or parliamentary. It is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a slightly stronger effect for presidential systems than for parliamentary. But regardless of the electoral rules or the pre-existing party system, the type of democracy, we see that these consistent effects across democracies where ruling party personalism is harmful. And then in terms of your second question, this is actually something that has come up a lot with the US and Trump in terms of when I talk about the book's findings, where people want to know about changes within the Republican Party in terms of its party personalism, which is, and I'm not an expert on India or Israel, but which sounds somewhat similar to what you're talking about here. And our measure of party personalism can't get at these changes over time during the leader's tenure, because it was important that we measure things before the leader had a chance to do harmful things to democracy. However, I mean, that actually should make it harder for us to see the findings that we see. But in terms of Trump and the US, Trump, when he came to power in 2016, the Republican Party is more personalist using our measure than it was prior to that, primarily because Trump did not have this long-standing experience in the party. At one point, he was supported the Democrats. He was all over the place. So we do see that for the U.S., at least in the Republican Party, that levels of personalism did go up when he came to power. It is very likely that if we were to be measuring it year by year, that for all these leaders that you mentioned, that party personalism would be going up during the course of their tenure. However, that's not something that we're able to disentangle with the data, because we wanted to make sure that we had our causal arrow in the right direction, and we're able to show that it was party personalism that happened first.
Yeah, and I'll just add it. I think we can speculate, and we've done a little bit of follow-up work, and we actually want to do one of these survey experiments and use the Indian case, and we posed the Israeli case, but it's probably not a good time to do a survey experiment there. Basically one thing that we think is going on is that these leaders are once they get into power, they're actually using their they start to undermine democracy, and that in itself is polarizing. And they're able to, increase their control over the party, internal control over the party, by polarizing society more. And certainly we've seen that in once Netanyahu has been in power, he has done a lot of stuff to increase the polarization within Israel. Before the October attacks, there were mass protests that sort of were occurring in response to Netanyahu's attempts to undermine democracy, particularly judicial constraint in Israel. And those attempts were themselves polarizing and producing these very polarized manifestations in society that you could see in the protests and counter protests. And so one of what, and that's different than other Likud leaders that were not quite as polarizing in society as Netanyahu was. And so we do see, I think that's part of the answer of how they become more personalized over time. And I also think that's part of the answer of why, so for example, the Republican Party is getting more personalized over time, right? And you see this process, particularly with the primaries in the United States, where loyalists to Trump are winning the primaries, and they're winning it based on the issue of January, how to interpret January 6th events. Was the election in 2020 stolen, which is still Trump's narrative, right? That's the issue that is winning loyalists, the way that loyalists are winning primary elections in the United States, and that causes turnover in the elites in the party. And soon the Republican Party won't have too many elites left who are willing to stand up to Trump the way that, say, Mike Pence stood up to Trump in January 6th.
Did we have, I think that, Joe, you answered some of the chat questions, so thank you. Did we have other questions?
Oh, we got some more hands raised, a couple of hands raised. Donna J, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you so much for such a fantastic talk on this topic. I'm Dhananjay from India. Could you hear me, Professor?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much once again for this fantastic talk, and I wish you all the best for your, this very nice book on this topic. My question is, you are saying that this elected strongman with populism and polarization, and you have given mainly the context of the Latin American countries. My question is, we do have certain societies where we find that the traditional social orders, they have been more danger to democratic setup, the formal democratic setup, political democracy. How you see that these strongmen could be utilized, rather used by these traditional order to undermine democracy, and how your theory fits into this?
I think it's the last part, the traditional. My speaker's not very good. How strongmen can use the traditional and then parties,
like breakdown of social, like basically different underlying societal breakdown to take advantage of the situation. So
yeah, I see.
Yeah. So we provide data in the book, not to, be boring and talk about data, that show that this is not something that's unique to any particular region. A lot of my examples today were from Latin America, but I've mentioned Benin and Hungary, and it's happening in a lot of different contexts globally. So personally, and Joe might say something different here, but I think a lot of the dynamics that are making these leaders, particularly popular or what have you, are very much context dependent. I don't think that there's a global narrative that helps to explain any of this. I do, however, think that in the past, let's say that a traditional programmatic party wasn't doing well and a new party might form, we were less likely to see the new parties that form be so focused on the individual. And I think that that's highly consequential. So we know that today, when new parties form, they're more likely to be more personalist than they were in the past. And a lot of this, and again, this is kind of my perspective on it, has to do with this changing media environment, where rather than having to launch out this, extensive organizational effort to get your name on the ballot, you can simply build up a brand on social media somewhat quickly and pursue all these shortcuts that can expedite things, but that ultimately are harmful because of the quality of the party. Joe, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so I think that every country has a very particular set of dynamics that become the issues of the day that people in the United States, it might be immigration. In El Salvador, it might be crime. It seems to me that in India, at least in part, that the BJP has tried to sort of polarize people over, basically endogenously sort of boost Hindu nationalism. And so those are particular to different countries. And so we're always going to have an explanation for why someone gets elected, looking back at the issues of the day that were important to voters. But we're trying to find sort of a global pattern of explanation that might be, give us a sense of what might explain this across time and across the world, some commonalities there.
Thank you so much, Professor.
There's another, Patrick, did you have a question you'd like to ask?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. I'm looking forward to the book. I just wanted to go back to something you just said in terms of the traditional ways of building a party and the relationship we've seen between the press and parties. And I know a little bit about Central European, and particularly Orban Viktor and Fidesz, where they clearly control all the media outlets at this point and have built it up over the past decade. I don't know about the other countries, but given, say, Charles Tilley's process of democratization and the old party system was a series of patronages. Are we at a point in our information society, if we want to call it post-modernity, that look, people can do this on the cheap now with a strong web presence, and in looking at those other countries and looking at Central America, looking at West Africa, across the Sahel, I don't know the communication systems there, but are those all centrally controlled press outlets? Is it getting even easier for these parties and strongmen to do this? And as an aside or a secondary issue, that someone like Orban is spending time with Trump and trying to build up a CPAC in Europe and is cozy with Putin. Do we see with these, though the parties are personalized, do we start seeing growing regional groupings of these kind of approaches to democracy? And I know these are asides that you may not have addressed it. I'm just curious to see what you have to say, and I'll leave it at that. Again, thank you for sharing your work with us. It's very impressive.
So those are great questions, and we've tried to sort of play with those or play with some answers for those. And you mentioned the Hungarian case was particularly with the media. We had a suspicion based on what Eric was talking about with Bukele in El Salvador that it's sort of people who are using non-traditional media as their sources of information, basically social media. They aren't reading newspapers, they aren't listening to television, they aren't listening to radio. If you want to group those as sort of the traditional sources of political information for a lot of people. And so we looked at survey data, basically said, are you more likely to support these kinds of parties if you get your information from those from social media or the internet rather than from traditional media sources? And so we looked for patterns to see if that was true. And if we exclude the Hungarian case, we find actually some decent evidence for that. And so we actually never published it because we just didn't want to exclude that one case. And I think what's going on in Hungary actually is one of these cases where Orban has systematically, forced the sale of traditional media outlets to effectively people who are his allies. And so it's a little bit of a different one where we saw the pattern we found in Hungary was actually sort of the opposite of the social media story, is people who got their information from traditional media sources where there is centralized control now, at least in the last half decade or so. That's a place where it was sort of the centralized control. So we actually don't have a consistent story over centralized control versus circumventing traditional media with social media. It's basically, can I get information out there and who's doing that? So that older supporters, for example, in Hungary were more likely, because they're more likely to use traditional media to support Orban than some of the younger voters. And that wasn't necessarily true I don't think in a place like El Salvador, where the main information mechanism that Bukele uses is social media. So that to me, that's sort of an open, still an open question. And what was it? The second one you had was, so the international alignment of these forces. So what's interesting is they're trying to sort of paint these as, I think what this sort of was it CPAC, whatever the acronym, I may not get that right, where they're sort of looking at this Hungary and some of the forces that are groups that are aligned with Trump in the United States and trying to spread this across countries. They pitch this as ideologically conservative. And what's interesting about our patterns and data is that, it could happen in a place where there's ideology isn't like the traditional left-right ideology isn't a huge issue, like in say Benin, or even in El Salvador, Bukele's rise to power isn't about traditional left-right issues in Latin America that have, dominated that political discussion for decades. Even though, the rise of Chavez was probably pretty ideologically, like he was an left-wing ideologue. And so we don't, maybe this will make a difference, these ideological groupings at the international level. But I think our story is bigger than sort of that ideological affinity that some of these leaders like Bolsonaro, Trump, or Orban might have for each other, and trying to look at the roots of this within the parties themselves, which spans these ideological groupings. So Kelsey, do you want to ask your question in case the people can't read it? You want to ask your question out loud?
Is this the vertical and horizontal accountability?
Yeah, and the digital.
Yeah, I was just about to try to type an answer that one.
Sorry about that. Yes. So you guys discuss horizontal and vertical accountability, and that gets at this institutional capacity to check an executive who's maybe expanding their unilateral power. But we also know, and SATO 2022 looks at this, but they also attack diagonal accountability. I think the previous question gets at this a little bit with capturing media, but what is civil society doing? What about the military? So some of these other institutions that could be captured and might be necessary in terms of entrenching a personalist leader. Do we see anything in those lines?
So we did not look into that. That's a great question. I was just typing. That's a great question. We didn't look into any of that systematically for the purposes of the book. However, we do know that it is very much, standard when these leaders are trying to consolidate power that they do target the media. Now, precisely what approach they take kind of varies across leaders. Sometimes they try to sideline the media and censor it. Other times they try to take it over and slowly, buy out essentially any dissenting voices. And similar things might happen with civil society in terms of efforts to undermine organization and organization building that could challenge them. One of the really tricky things in all of this, because a lot of times the big question is, well, what could we do to prevent this sort of thing from happening? That's kind of been a common theme in the last decade or so. And one of the tricky things that we know is that a lot of times once these processes really get going, they're difficult even for a very vibrant and active civil society organization to do much about. And that kind of comes out of the data in the book, where when these parties have the legislative majority, all sorts of really troubling things can happen as a consequence, even in places where opposition to the leader is really intense. So that's kind of my take on the role of vertical accountability and the ways in which leaders are able to leverage their ever increasing bargaining situation to undermine these groups and voices.
Yeah, my 2 cents that I'll just add is that what we're talking about is the personalization of the party that is creating a bunch of getting a party that helps you gain and keep power and do things in legislatures, maybe infiltrate the bureaucracy and making a party of loyalists. Where that and this comes out of our work with dictatorships, but where we think that is really, really, really sort of has terrible consequences is when they're, and we haven't looked at this for democratically elected leaders, the sample in our book yet, but when they control security agents, internal security agents, right? Where they're able to, even if civil society starts to organize protests, the security apparatus, internal security apparatus remains loyal to the leader in the face of that and is basically able to use mass violence against them. We saw some of that happen actually, I think in Nicaragua, right? The protest was in 2019.
18.
With 2018, okay. It met with repression, and then subsequently locking up a lot of opposition candidates, right? So this sort of very overt repressive stuff going on, which is different, a little bit different than saying I'm going to, force the sale of a media company to one of my allies, the way you would have this in Hungary, where there wasn't mass repression necessarily of police or internal security agents shooting people on the streets.
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of a lot of so I studied in part the capture of civil society in the process of democratic backsliding, and a lot of these leaders at some point implement like a foreign agents law in which they're able to co-opt civil society. They kick out people who they see as potentially terrorists or money launderers or whatever other legal term they deign, and then they infiltrate civil society with government operated non-governmental organizations. And so I was wondering if you saw any relationship there, but it doesn't sound like you guys got that that deep.
No, not yet. I mean, that'd be a great follow-on project.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So I think that's everything. Okay. Thank you. We're gonna, we'll close now. Thank you everyone for being such a great audience and for these excellent questions and listening through all of this. And thank you, Sarah, for inviting us to be part of the talk today.
Thank you so much, everybody. See you. Thank you, Joe and Erica, and thank you for a great discussion.
Take care.
Bye now.